Well, hello, and welcome back to the Video Psychosis podcast. This is episode number 2. I'm your host, Strong KNOTZ, and if you haven't heard episode 1, you should probably go back and check this out because this is a special 2-part episode focusing on the 68 horror films that I watched for Halloween in 2018. I went through the years 1933, starting with The Invisible Man, and ended with Critters from 1986 in the last episode. So if you want to hear my coverage of those films, feel free to go back and check that out. For this special episode, part 2, episode number 2, focusing on that Halloween list once again, we're going to cover the years 1986 through 2018. This episode will begin and end with anthology horror films, appropriately. We're going to immediately pick up where we left off, so enjoy the show. And once again, I'm Strong KNOTZ. This is Video Psychosis, the Halloween Viewing List 2018, Part 2.
Number 35 on the list.
Screamtime from 1986. Actually kind of conflicting knowledge on the year of this release. Screamtime originally was released in 1983 in the UK, which is where the actual stories in the film were made. And I believe it was released in 84 in the US, where they filmed the wraparounds, which are really poor. It's a guy stealing some videotapes from a rental store, and he goes home to watch them and kind of spoils the evening for his friend whose house it is and his girlfriend. And he watches these movies. And eventually, the films come to life and attack him. And I have to tell you, don't worry about spoilers for this movie. Even if you're an anthology horror fan like me, even if you're nuts about the genre, you can skip this one. It's not one of the better films. It's definitely one of the worst. It's not in the conventional sense like,
oh, this is just such a bad movie.
It's not really one of the worst movies I ever saw. But it rides the line. It's pretty mediocre. There's a couple things in it that are amusing, but not enough to make up for the runtime. So you can definitely skip out on Screamtime. I wasn't a big fan. If you are, I would like to hear your reasoning. Maybe you have some very astute things to say about Screamtime. I would find that amusing, for sure. So hit me up. Maybe you'll change my mind. I doubt it, though. Next film on the list, Trick or Treat from 1986. Not to be confused with Trick or Treat 2007, which makes an appearance on this list. The 1986 Trick or Treat is a rock and roll based kind of horror film. Really interesting movie. It's got Ozzy Osbourne in a little cameo. He plays this preacher on TV who gets killed with a really neat special effect. Focuses on this kid who's obsessed with a rock star who dies tragically young and comes back to possess the kid who's his fan. He gets this, like, I think it's a 45 record of his, like, last song, and he plays it backwards, and, you know, Sammy Carr, this dead musician, takes over the kid. And it is pretty good. I would say it's, if not the best, among the best rock and roll horror movies. That's a pretty poor subgenre in general, because you've got really stinky movies like Terror on Tour or Hard Rock Zombies, but Trick or Treat is actually a really entertaining entry to that little subgenre. And I would like to note that Robert Elswit shot the movie. You probably recognize him from his work with Paul Thomas Anderson. He shot Boogie Nights, There Will Be Blood, Inherent Vice. He's worked a lot with Paul Thomas Anderson and other filmmakers. He's a pretty popular cinematographer. But I thought it was really cool that he had his touch on the movie. There's a lot of good panning shots. There's one where the camera kind of moves under a volleyball net and you see someone standing looking past into the distance. Pretty good. Good movie. It's got definitely a lot of entertaining moments. It might not be for the more serious horror fans, people who like to stick with the classics, but it is a really enjoyable movie and a good time, and I would say better executed than the average film, specifically in that subgenre. Like I said, there's not that many good rock and roll horror movies. I think Shock 'em Dead is one of the more popular ones, and you could argue maybe Return of the Living Dead to an extent. But Trick or Treat is definitely worth checking out. Pretty cool little movie. Next film on the list, something I'd already seen, Evil Dead 2, 1987, Sam Raimi, classic. Well, my girlfriend hadn't seen it, and a friend of mine hadn't seen it who was visiting, so I figured this is a perfect opportunity. Kill two birds with one stone, and they seem to enjoy it. I can't imagine a lot of people not enjoying this movie. Roger Ebert enjoyed it. And, I mean, there's not really a lot to say about Evil Dead 2 in 2018. You know, they've got a Showtime show of it now, which I admittedly have seen none of. I'm kind of comfortable having only seen the first 3 Evil Dead films. I'd like to leave my worldview of those films ending with Army of Darkness, preferably the director's cut ending, but I'll get back to that later. Evil Dead 2 is just a classic. If you haven't seen it, you know, you've got to see it. If you get a chance to see it in the theater, see it that way, because it's great with a crowd. It's a really fun movie. Excellent effects, really creative, innovative stuff. You know, the Raimis were tight with the Coen brothers, and you'll notice kind of similar things throughout a lot of their earlier films. Next film on the list, we have Splatter Farm, 1987. And this is the first of 2 Polonia Brothers films that I have on my viewing. Splatter Farm was my favorite of the 2. I watched Splatter Farm and Feeders, and I liked Splatter Farm a lot more. A lot of my friends who have seen tons of shot-on-video films tend to say that this is among the more disturbing ones made in that format. And I would definitely agree. There's not a lot of goofiness to Splatter Farm. There's a lot of taboo stuff in this movie that's handled in a way that they are actually trying to disrupt the viewer and freak you out. And I admire that they went for that. I think it's cool that you can somehow convince family members and friends to be in this movie and tell them things like, okay, so you're playing this grandma and you rape your grandson. You know, you drug him and you sexually assault him. And it's like, you know, it's so strange seeing these people who you know is like, it's like, you think this actress, she looks like, is this somebody's aunt? Or like, who is this in the movie? And it just seems like such an odd thing to ask people close to you to do things like this in your movie, especially knowing how cheaply it's made. And that does add to the effect of it. Being shot on video gives it this even nastier feel. There's lots of effects shots in the movie, and because it's cheaper, it'll be hit or miss for a lot of viewers. They maintain this gross outlook throughout the movie that just makes the taboos seem more effective as it passes along. Incest and rape and just violent mutilation, and these are things that a lot of people don't want to sit through in a movie. And probably a lot of people who are watching shot-on-video movies want to get like a laugh out of seeing what essentially looks like a home movie, but with gore in it. And, you know, Splatter Farm doesn't take that easy laugh route like a lot of those films do. Splatter Farm gets in your face and says, hey, if I don't freak you out, at least I tried. And it will freak a lot of people out. I know seasoned veterans who claim to have been grossed out by that movie. I wasn't personally as impacted by it, but psychologically, a lot of other kind of things freak me out more than the things represented in Splatter Farm. But definitely a good movie. A strong movie if you like shot on video. And the Polonia brothers, of course, a hallmark of that world. Splatter Farm is the perfect antidote to the next film that I'm about to talk about, which is also shot on video, but it's directed by Nick PHILLIPS, aka Nick Millard. It's called The Cemetery Sisters, 1987, and I have to tell you, it's not a very good movie. It's very likely a bad movie. But if you've seen any of Nick Millard's other films, and I have the sad distinction of having only seen 2, this film, The Cemetery Sisters, and Crazy Fat Ethel 2. Crazy Fat Ethel 2 is undoubtedly one of the worst movies ever made. It's achingly bad, absolutely inept, just totally ridiculous from beginning to end in the worst way possible. A lot of scenes of a character having flashbacks to what essentially ends up as recycled footage from the first film. And I actually like Criminally Insane. Crazy Fat Ethel 2 is a slap in the face. It probably has an even more disreputable use of recycled footage than Silent Night, Deadly Night 2. And Crazy Fat Ethel 2 is barely even an hour long. I'm not even sure if it is an hour long. I think it's about like 50, 60 minutes, somewhere in there. And it feels long. So, having said that, if you have sat through Crazy Fat Ethel 2, watching The Cemetery Sisters is a walk in the park. It looks like an accomplished feature compared to Crazy Fat Ethel 2. But taking The Cemetery Sisters on its own merits, it's repetitive, it's kind of boring, the effects are poor, the actors aren't doing a whole lot, and there's not much story. It's most people's idea of a straightforward, bad movie. And I'm not going to argue against that. But I will say this movie is 100 million times better than Crazy Fat Ethel 2. If you've never heard of Crazy Fat Ethel 2 or you don't know much about Nick Millard's movies, you should definitely look into the Red Letter Media review. They pretty much go into comprehensive detail on why you should spend your life avoiding Crazy Fat Ethel 2. So, take it from me. Next movie on the list.
Number 40.
A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, 1988. Directed by Rennie Harlan, the man who brought you such thrilling fare as Cliffhanger with Sylvester Stallone and John Lithgow. Lithgow? Lithgow? Who knows? The Dream Master, I liked this one actually. I'm not averse to the Freddy movies. I enjoy them. I don't enjoy that series as much as the Friday the 13th films, but I do think the Nightmare on Elm Street films are better than the Halloween series, which only has 3 good movies, in my opinion. At least the Freddy films are a little more consistent, and they play with that notion of what's intentionally supposed to please the crowd and what can actually scare an audience. The first film in the series does have some great, just classic horror movie moments, and after that they make Freddy a little bit funnier each movie to most people's detriment, but those films are still really enjoyable, and I have no problem with horror comedy. I don't mind punny villains, you know. If you can sit through Nail Gun Massacre, then I don't see what problem you could have with any Nightmare on Elm Street movie. It's the same thing. And, you know, if you like action movies, how can you not be a sucker for bad puns? If you'll take them in your Schwarzeneggers, you should take them with your Freddy Kruegers. But that being said, The Dream Master surprised me because I was confusing it with, I think, the 5th film, which is The Dream Child. I'm pretty sure that movie opens up with a scene of somebody walking away from a school bus or something. I tried to watch that one, whichever film it is, on TV a long time ago, and I just thought it was really boring. And so I kind of have avoided watching a lot of the Freddy movies because I was like, when I get to that movie, I know it's going to be tough. And so I finally watched The Dream Master, and it wasn't that movie. And I have to say I enjoyed it. Probably a lot of people would look down on it. It's, you know, generic horror sequel. They amp up the effects, and they lessen the story and the scares, but it works in this movie. For me, I really like the nightmare sequences in this one, with that dog in the junkyard who pisses on the ground, and his piss is pure flames that scorch the earth and open up hell. Absolutely amazing. And, you know, this guy is cornered by cars in the junkyard, and there's a bit where this woman floats up underneath a guy's bed, and Freddy jumps out, sucks him through the water, and kind of like a callback, I guess, to the first movie. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot more entertaining than it would be. A lot of people don't like the second film, though, and I like that movie, so maybe that tells you something about me. As far as I'm concerned, the first 4 are good. Freddy's Dead is totally absurd, really corny, but still enjoyable. I mean, there's not much you can say about a Freddy Krueger movie. It's about one and the same, really. Number 41 on this list is the exact opposite of a generic movie. Frank Henenlotter's Brain Damage, 1988. I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit this is my first time watching this movie. Tried to watch it several times before, and once again just said, I have to be in the mood for this. I can't not be in the mood to watch this, especially a movie with a lot of screaming. If you're not in the mood to hear a lot of screaming, you probably shouldn't put on a Frank Henenlotter movie. Save it for a time when you've taken aspirin. Screaming can be quite good in the right hands, and Henenlotter is an example of such hands. This movie is really funny. I think it might be my favorite film of his. I grew up pretty much adoring Basket Case. I was always a big fan of that movie. And I saw Frankenhooker shortly thereafter, and I've put off watching the Basket Case sequels because I wanted to watch Brain Damage first. And having seen it the full way through, I have to say, it's just a classic movie to me. I can't understand how anybody could not admire the originality of this movie. And it does play with the metaphor of drug addiction in that its little creature is sort of like a pusher supplying this juice that gets its user high through the back of his neck, but then forces him to find other people that he can suck the brains out of to sustain momentum. It's like that parasitic sort of relationship there. Henenlotter isn't afraid to throw a lot of great jokes in there, and it blends well with the New York vibe that the film presents. It's got that authentic feeling, and there's even a cameo from the character from the first Basket Case film, Dwayne. He shows up on this train that the protagonist is riding on, and he's got the basket. And of course, this guy who's being sucked lifeless by Elmer the parasite is just staring him down into eternity, and our basket-carrying friend, you know, flees the train in terror, or the subway, as it were. Brain Damage is a great movie, and definitely one of the strongest films from this list, I would say. It's quintessential viewing if you're an 80s horror fan. The next movie that I'm going to talk about is not essential viewing at all. It's called Hack-O-Lantern, aka Halloween Night, 1988. Directed by Jag Mundra, and he also made Open House, 1987, which I hear is good. But I heard this movie was good, and it was lies. You people are liars. This movie is so bad. What do you people see in this movie? I don't understand the hype on this movie. It fails unremittingly at being any number of different movies. It's a bad rock and roll horror movie. It's a bad slasher film. It tries to blend these genres. It tries to meld these genres, and it does not succeed whatsoever. I was bored lifeless by this movie. I could not believe how overhyped this movie is. I would love to hear somebody tell me why they like this movie so much. This movie does not stand out to me as even being one of the notable 80s horror films. I can't really put it any more bluntly than to say that it's ultimately a waste of time. You should be watching Trick or Treat instead, the 1986 movie I referenced earlier. Or if you want to see something remotely close to Hack-O-Lantern, you know what, go watch Hollowgate instead. Hollowgate is a much better film than Hack-O-Lantern. And Hollowgate is totally nonsensical, but it's a hell of a lot better than Hack-O-Lantern. So I kind of await seeing Open House with bated breath now. I'll check it out. I really hope it'll change my opinion of old Jag Mundra, but I don't know. We'll see what happens there. I'm not going to bullshit you. Hack-O-Lantern, one of the worst movies I watched this month. I watched almost 70 movies, and I watched a lot of crap, and Hack-O-Lantern is toward the top of that list. Hack-O-Lantern, after about 40 minutes, you just zone out. But to its credit, the main actor who plays the satanic grandpa role, I believe his name is Pike, which is a very folklore name if I've ever heard one. So I'll give it credit for that. And the grandpa is the best part of the movie. But once again, it's not enough. There's not enough of anything in Hack-O-Lantern. There's not enough blood. There's not enough story. There's not enough fun. It's just bad all around. The next film, Pulse, 1988. Killer electricity movie with a PG-13 rating. It's fun for the whole family. Pulse is way better than Hack-O-Lantern. Pulse is probably not everybody's idea of a great horror movie. It's got a lot of flaws, but I enjoyed it. I thought that it was pretty good for a family-friendly horror movie. For a film about killer electricity, it does manage to convey some pretty interesting things you haven't seen in a lot of other horror movies. And there's a lot of close-ups of like electronics and they're going haywire. What's about to happen? And there's this weird mythology with the story where, you know, the electricity in this neighborhood is basically causing different people there to snap from watching their TV or, you know, using their phone too much or whatever. It's basically, that movie is What If Phones, but too much. So it's about 30 years ahead of its time, clearly. You know, not a bad film. It was okay. I think if you're going to get together and watch a movie with your kids that is appropriate for both of you, then yeah, sure, Pulse is not so bad. Check it out. Why not? Not one of my strongest recommendations, but it's got its merits. I liked Pulse. It was okay. The next film on the list is a lot better than okay. It's The Blob from 1988, and it's one of the best remakes ever made, just like Cronenberg's The Fly. The Blob is terrific. I just saw the original film from the 50s, the Irvin Yeaworth joint, for the first time this year, and I gotta say, I really like that one too. Just like the Fly films, I think they're both great. I think they stand on their own legs. I think they're kind of the same film, but told in a different style, and they both succeed indomitably at that. The Blob, of course, is noted for its special effects. They're really terrific. There's this great scene where somebody's trapped in a phone booth and like the blob is totally surrounding the phone booth and it's turning dark in there and you just see the purplish inside of this like swollen miasma, whatever the hell it is. Faces and limbs of people that it's sucked up just start appearing close to the glass, and it's a really freaky moment. And it's got a really young Shawnee Smith before she was on TV's Becker and the Saw movies, and she's much better in this movie than that kind of stuff. It's not much of a role, but she's pretty fun in it. And there's a wealth of character actors here. There's a lot of good actors here, like Jack Nance from the David Lynch films, you know, Henry from Eraserhead. And a lot of actors show up here that you probably wouldn't expect. That definitely adds to the charm of it. Kevin Dillon is maybe not necessarily the strongest lead in the world, but, you know, he passes. He does a pretty decent job in this movie. It's definitely worth watching. Really fun movie. Now, The Blob, like I said, stands as one of the great remakes, but it's good in that it's both faithful to the original and it kind of updates. It's one of those movies that I think sort of comments on that 50s era and the nostalgia for it, not unlike maybe the original The Thing and John Carpenter's remake, where it's basically the same movie, but you're just updating the situation and making it more appropriate for the current time. But they work pretty well together. You can watch the original and then watch the remake right afterward with that film, and it works pretty well. Number 45, which is a little 1988 shot-on-video film by John Duncan called The Hackers. And boy, this movie has one of the all-time great theme songs, not just in horror movie history, but in movie history, period. Really, the theme song to this movie is so funny. It gets stuck in my head all the time. It's really great. It's like this kind of trashy 80s rock thing going on. Add another notch to the blade. It's pretty good. And unfortunately, the movie can't really match up to the theme song so much. The movie is worth watching. If you like shot-on-video films, you get these sort of lunatic characters that aren't unlike Bill Moseley and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. The film kind of plays with a lot of horror tropes and doesn't do anything new, but it gives you what you expect for that kind of film. And I wouldn't put it among the best in that subgenre there, but, you know, worth checking out. If you like shot-on-video, it's a pretty decent one. Lots of funny stuff in there. There's a scene of these psychopaths running around on a playground, you know, flipping around on the monkey bars and stuff. So it's got its little quirks to it, and the ending is not very well thought out, but what the hell are you gonna do? It could be a lot worse. Moving on here. We start off 1989. Friday the 13th, Part 8. Jason Takes Manhattan. A lot of people don't like this movie. Pretty frequently trashed. I have to wonder if a lot of the gore that got cut, I wonder if it would be more accepted, because for a Friday the 13th film, it does skimp a little bit on the gore, but then you find out that they had to cut it down for the MPAA, and that contributes to it. Which is a little bit of a shame. That's part of the reason you watch a Friday the 13th movie. You know, you want to see some pretty neat kills. And to be denied the glory of the blood is a little bit sad, to tell you the truth. But I did enjoy this movie. It's fun watching Jason romp around in New York. He doesn't even get there until about an hour into the movie. And there's a scene that's pretty hit or miss, love it or leave it, where he fights this wannabe boxer. And he ends up just one punch knocking this dude's head off his shoulders. I mean, I thought that was hilarious. But a lot of people probably don't want to see Jason box with some dude on a rooftop. So if that's not your idea of a funny movie, then maybe stay away from this one. I think it's in grand tradition with the first 7 films. I don't have a problem with any of the first 8 films in the series. I like all the Paramount Jason movies. To one degree or another, they kind of comment on each other. As the series progresses, you tend to notice they try to switch up the idea of what a Jason movie is each time. Like, suddenly there's a psychic kid. You know, suddenly there's Jason's taking the bag off his head. He's got a hockey mask now. The killer isn't Pamela Voorhees anymore. And they try to kind of keep the story changing as it goes throughout those first 8 films, so I enjoy them. I wouldn't even call them guilty pleasures. I just like movies like that. And there's a reason that franchise is so successful and so popular, you know. It really is pretty wildly entertaining. And I think Jason Voorhees is a lot more fun to watch go around doing his thing than Michael Myers. Those movies really drop off in quality after the 3rd one. I think Season of the Witch is a pretty damn good film. And the trouble starts with number 4. After that, it just gets unbearably bad. I haven't seen this newest one, the David Gordon Green one. I'm pretty on the fence about seeing it, even though I like him as a director. But Eastbound and Down, I don't expect it to be. So I probably won't be seeing that one anytime soon. I mean, you know, once you start putting Busta Rhymes in these movies, it's probably a sign something is not going well. But regardless, Jason Takes Manhattan is a pretty fun movie. And I would say if you like the other Paramount Jason films, definitely check it out. After that, the series derails a little bit, but you can only keep it going for so long. Next on the list, previously viewed, 1989, Scott Spiegel, Intruder. The VHS release of this film is cut pretty bad, which is an absolute shame because the gore effects in this movie are spectacular. You've got, I'm pretty sure it's KNB, pre-KNB. Intruder is worth your time because it takes a really interesting approach to the setting of the film and keeps the action isolated within and around this grocery store, and it's about a crew of people working the night shift who start getting picked off one by one, and you have to kind of figure out who's doing this and why. And there's like an abusive ex-boyfriend element, you know, the guy just got out of jail and he's back, and if I can't have you, nobody can, that kind of thing. And Bruce Campbell shows up as a cop at the end for about 40 seconds, so if you go in and you've heard people say, hey, it's great, Bruce Campbell's in it, you should watch it. Well, he's not in that much of it, so don't really go in like, when's Bruce Campbell gonna show up? It's a really good slasher movie. I would put it in the top 10. There's some really, really gruesome deaths, and it's really funny. The Repo Man beer makes an appearance. You can't say no to that. There's a lot of funny stuff. Ted Raimi, I think, kind of steals the movie. as the butcher, or like he's basically the guy who cuts up the fruit, the produce in the back of the store, and he's got his headphones on. He's just bopping along to some song for half the movie, just doing hilarious Ted Raimi stuff like spitting out watermelon seeds and dancing like a fool. But yeah, Intruder is definitely one of the best, and Danny Hicks from Evil Dead 2 is unforgettable in it. The ending is really stupid. I have to say the ending is probably the only bad thing in this movie for my taste, but it doesn't ruin the effect. I really think it's one of the best slashers. Definitely watch Intruder. Another movie you should definitely watch, if you're into this kind of thing, is Things. Andrew Jordan, Barry Gillis, 1989. More Canadian filmmaking, but at its finest, I would say. This is the ultimate horror hoser movie. If you could imagine Strange Brew mixed with Suspiria, and maybe kind of directed by someone who's drank a few too many beers, that's Things. Things is just one of those oddities in that it's a really dumb movie. Things is dumb. I don't think you'll find anyone out there that says that it's smart or it plays with the genre in a cool way. Like, so you just have an assemblage of rough moments that either don't make sense or are blatantly taken from other films. And that's kind of Things. But it stands on its own as being this unique film that every aspect of the production is mind-bogglingly bad, to the point where it smacks out of the ballpark and goes from being unintentionally funny to almost a comedic masterpiece. It's really, really funny. And if you have a hard time getting through bad movies, this will be like nails on a chalkboard for you. If you're one of those people that takes pleasure in the truly bizarre and unruly, Things is just a watershed moment in filmmaking. It's unbelievable. There's a scene where a guy farts on a sandwich, and there's a total silence for about 10 seconds after that. And the guy sitting across from him just says, "Sounds good." It's that kind of movie. It's the kind of movie where people talk about a Salvador Dali painting on the wall that's not actually a Salvador Dali painting. This guy who lives in a trailer in Canada, oh, he got this painting from the Queen of England. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Things will be, to a lot of people, just a piece of shit. I think this movie is terrific. I love it. It's hilarious. I've seen it several times. I'm sure some people would shake their head in horror at the fact that I've seen it more than twice. I've probably seen it maybe even like 4 or 5 times. And it gets better every time. It always makes me laugh. I love that Tailspin song. Familiar Strangers, whatever their name was. Music by Strychnine. There's a lot of funny things about this movie. You know, they convince Amber Lynn to show up, and then they play a mean-spirited porn star gag on her at one point. And it's like, what was the purpose of that? It's just totally mind-blowing. So, Things, 1989. Check it out. Don't confuse it with the Dennis Devine anthology film, also called Things. Really bad sequel. Andrew Jordan and Barry Gillis film dominates, by far. Next film, we're moving into the 90s here, 1990, Death by Temptation, directed by James Bond III. This is a really good movie. It was stuck with trauma for a long time, and now Vinegar Syndrome has it, and they just put out a really, really good Blu-ray. It's got the late, great Bill Nunn in it, who you might recognize from Spike Lee's films. Sam Jackson plays this preacher, the main character's father in it. And it's about these two brothers who are living in the city together. One of them is like trying to be an actor or something. The other one used to be a preacher, and he's had that lapsed Catholic thing. He's like, I'm not a preacher anymore, you know. And so they get together in New York, and they're sort of living the life. And there's this woman who's a vampire. It's a vampire film, but not in the traditional sense. And the movie plays around a lot. There's a lot of neat stuff going on here. Bill Nunn's character is really funny. He's that womanizer in a bar who's always telling stories. That guy who chases skirts, you know, he's that guy who's always talking about sexcapades he's had that very likely didn't happen. And there's a lot of great dialogue in this movie where it's not really memorable lines. There's a really good dialogue scene where the two brothers are just sitting on the couch or in the living room talking about how they're going to go to the bar. And this ex-preacher says, I'm going to get a big glass full of milk. I'm going to get a stein full of milk in this bar, and I want him to slide it down the bar to me like in those old saloons, like the Wild West. Like, what kind of dialogue is this? But it really sharpens the movie, I think, and it gives it this edge that makes it feel kind of, it's its own thing. Through and through. There's a little nod to Cronenberg's Videodrome toward the end there that's really interesting and has a political touch to it. Commentary on the Reagan era, which is provided a few times throughout the movie. And I think this movie should please a lot of people. It's good that it's finally getting acclaim and attention after all these years. It is a really good movie, and I'm glad I've finally seen it. So, Death by Temptation. Definitely check that out. Try and get a hold of that Vinegar Syndrome Blu-ray if you can. Next movie I'm going to talk about, Grim Prairie Tales, 1990. Directed by Wayne Coe, and it's got James Earl Jones and Brad Dourif. This is an unusual example of an anthology horror film and one of the many on this list. It takes place in the Wild West, but at least one of the stories isn't really a horror story, and it doesn't have this negative, twisty, shocking horror movie ending. It kind of subverts what you expect from it in a few ways. But that being said, you might not expect to go into a James Earl Jones movie and see a woman who can suck men into their vagina. I was pretty surprised by that. There's a neat little commentary on vagina dentata there, and it is a pretty mixed bag, so a lot of viewers might not love it, but I think it's worth seeing. A lot better than Screamtime, not quite on the level of The House of the Dead, but an interesting anthology film. Now, a much better anthology film that just doesn't get the credit it deserves. 1990, Brian Peck, The Willies. This is a great movie. I'm not sure to say too much about it. It's kind of grown in stature in the last few years. I think people have warmed up to The Willies, which might not be a phrase you want to use about this movie considering it was directed by a pedophile. That's right. I know everybody makes that big hassle about Victor Salva, Ghost House, all that stuff. You probably didn't know Brian Peck, director of The Willies, was accused of the same thing. It makes it a little bit harder to watch a movie with so many kids in it. It's a much better film than anything Victor Salva's made. That guy really isn't a good director, and the fact that he's still allowed to work is pretty shameful. So this movie from 28, almost 30 years ago now, if you can kind of put those notions to the side, The Willies is a fun movie. It's got Clu Gulager in it, who's usually a lot of fun. But if you watch MST3K, you know you got to stay on Clu Gulager alert, so take heed of that. But I don't know, I really like this movie. I think it's really funny. It's got some neat little effects in it, and it's definitely from that Nickelodeon era where it sort of has that Are You Afraid of the Dark feel to it. It definitely has that sort of Monsters vibe, you know, the 1988 TV show. But it has the distinction of having a very cartoonish feel to it. And it's got one of the actors from Salute Your Shorts in it, I believe. So it's like a good time capsule for people of my generation, I think, who grew up in the 90s. And I would recommend it to anthology horror fans just as being a really enjoyable movie. It's a good time movie. Next on the list, Bad Karma, 1991. British short film, shot on video, directed by Alex Chandon. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. It wasn't bad. I would just say it was okay. Some pretty cool special effects, some pretty well done effects in it, but it aims a little bit too much toward comedy and becomes a little unbearable as it goes along. But luckily it's only a little bit over a half hour, so you can kind of get in, get out, get what you need. Split. I wouldn't call it bad, and like I said, really cool effects in it. It's probably one of about 3 or 4 British films I have on this list, and better than Screamtime. I'll tell you that. 1991, next film on the list, HauntedWeen. Some more shot on video stuff. HauntedWeen it was filmed in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and it's like a very sort of small town, let's get together, make a horror movie. It's got that sort of feeling to it. Pretty fun. There's a part of the story where characters are at this horror house, you know, Halloween freak show type place, and it's like Netherworld, one of those type places, and they think they're seeing actors doing special effects on stage, but actually it's this guy who killed somebody like 20 years ago, and he's come back to the carnival to kill people, but nobody knows it's real. And so, you know, he's just like baseball batting people's heads off, and the crowd loves it. And if you don't like that really over the top kind of stuff in your horror movies, you won't like it. It's homegrown, just like a lot of other films on this list. But I think it's a really fun little movie. The ending seems a little anticlimactic, but I can't complain too much about that because everything has to end somewhere, I suppose.
Number 54 on the list.
Army of Darkness, 1992. And I watched the director's cut, the official bootleg edition. I've always liked the ending of the director's cut better than the theatrical version. It feels like an appropriate way to end the series. If you've seen the Evil Dead movies and you know about the making of them, you know that behind the scenes, Sam Raimi loved to give Bruce Campbell a hard time, and he was punishing him, just torturing him throughout that shoot, pouring 55 gallons of fake blood directly over his face through a drum vat and making the man sneeze red for 2 weeks. And the ending of Army of Darkness, the director's cut, totally reflects that, because the character, Ash, just can't catch a break. None of these movies will let him end happily, and that's why the ending of Army of Darkness has always felt a little kind of off to me, because the first film ends with him not being able to escape this spirit. It just flies into his mouth. And the second film ends with him being sucked back into time, and now how am I going to get back? And that's where we pick up with Army of Darkness, for those of you who haven't seen it. And it's interesting because the director's cut ending is perfect. It really is perfect to me. Ash doesn't follow the rules, and he makes a mistake, just like when he pronounces those words from The Day the Earth Stood Still with the Necronomicon. Klaatu, Barada. He doesn't remember the words. And he fucks up another time. And you can't make a mistake and get away with it when you're playing with this occult stuff. And he doesn't take the right amount of drops in this little pacifier thing, and he takes one too many, and he goes forward by like 100 years or something, as opposed to where he's supposed to be, I guess in 1992. He ends up in 2092 or whatever, and the world's been destroyed and it's post-apocalyptic, and there's no people, and he's just stuck alone with this big beard, waking up like, oh, what's happened? And it's the perfect summation. It's like the ultimate cruelty for Ash to have to endure. And like knowing that Sam Raimi wouldn't give Bruce Campbell a break, it just seems right that there shouldn't be a sense of relief for the character. I'm totally okay with The Evil Dead, just the world of those movies ending with Ash trapped in time, totally alone. I think it's reminiscent of the Twilight Zone. That guy is surrounded by all the books, and he breaks his glasses. And that's what happens to Ash at the end of Army of Darkness in the director's cut. And I enjoy the theatrical ending with him and S-Mart blasting the Deadite that came into modern times, but it's campy, and that's not how those movies should end to me. I think the director's cut is pretty much official. Next film on the list, speaking of homegrown horror, Psycho Pike, 1992. Canadian film pretending to be American, just like Funeral Home. Humorously, I really liked Psycho Pike. I expected it to be middle-of-the-road shot-on-video stuff, and it was pretty damn entertaining. It riffs on horror tropes in a pretty fun way. The main character, who you think is a good guy at first, turns out to be not such a good guy. And, it does these neat little things, kind of like Just Before Dawn, Jeff Lieberman's film. These kind of subtle things that turn the wheel on how a horror movie usually runs. And I wouldn't say it's anything amazing, but I would put it among the better shot-on-video movies. I enjoyed it as a killer fish movie way more than Joe Dante's Piranha, so that just might be my own personal taste. It's pretty obviously a puppet, the killer fish in the movie, the killer Pike, because you never really see it, the second half of it. You always kind of see it right by the edge of the frame, like someone's hand is in it, moving it along or something, or holding it from the back by the tail. And that's not detrimental to the film, to me. It's amusing enough in the way it plays with these notions of the killer fish movie that it redeems itself. You don't expect this movie to go anywhere new, but it kind of takes you by surprise a little bit. Psycho Pike is one of those films that isn't as widely known. It's being circulated mostly in bootlegs now, and people are kind of finding out about that movie through bootleg tapes, and it's getting its own little cult. So it's kind of catching on, and I think that's a good thing. Next movie on the list, Ticks, 1993. Oh man, this is an interesting one. What a cast. You got Clint Howard, Alfonso Ribeiro from The Fresh Prince. You got little Seth Green, little baby Seth Green, before he started doing really bad comedy. And speaking of really bad comedy, there's a lot of it in this movie. Carlton is supposed to be a tough guy. I think he's like a pseudo-tough guy, where he says he beats people up, and then you find out he's nobody. It's kind of like, I would put it among those sort of semi-gross-out horror movies like Squirm, or Society, or like Slugs, as just being a film that's mostly about the effects and the prosthetics and, oh, look, Clint Howard's got this thing on his face, gross! It's like one of those movies. Clint Howard, I think, reminds me of that Ebert maxim again. If you see Clint Howard in a movie, it's usually probably going to be pretty good. Or at least pretty enjoyable. Stuff like Evil Speak or Ice Cream Man. It's not going to be to everybody's tastes, but if you soak up that Nacho Belgrande cinema, you're going to love it. And I did enjoy Ticks. I didn't think it was one of the best movies I watched this month, but it lived up to what I always expected it to be. I mean, it had big-ass ticks. That's what I wanted to see, big-ass ticks. And there were big-ass ticks in that movie. So there you have it. Moving on, 1995, little Swedish film called Evil Ed. I've been familiar with this movie for a long time because it's got one of those classic VHS covers, with the guy's head split in half. And I always just assumed it was some, just horror comedy, whatever. I think the making of this movie and why it was made is more interesting than the movie itself. It's really over the top. It's spectacularly over the top, and it's undisciplined. It's a mess, really. It's about this editor that loses his mind editing this horror movie, and he becomes a horror movie character, basically. And they call in the army, and they call in the cops, and it gets so insane that you can't keep up with it. Like I mentioned earlier, you get overwhelmed by it. I got overwhelmed by Evil Ed, and I didn't find it as charming as I wanted to, but some of it is really funny. And the fact that they made this film as directly as a response to Swedish censorship is the most interesting thing about it. So I didn't love it. I kind of liked it. I felt like it could use some editing. It felt a little long. And like I said, it gets too over the top to the point where you just can't invest in the story or take it seriously anymore. But I would be open to seeing it again. So I would kind of recommend it. Check out Evil Ed. If you like super gore movies, it'll fulfill on that level. Because there's a lot of the arterial stuff spraying all over the place. Next movie, 1996, Feeders. My second Polonia Brothers film on the list, and not half as good as Splatter Farm. Feeders was co-directed with John McBride, who made the immensely disappointing Wood Chipper Massacre. I'll never get over that. How can you put massacre in the title of your movie if like 2 people get killed and one of them gets killed on accident? That's not a massacre. How is that a massacre? Anyway, this movie is in a league beyond Wood Chipper Massacre. It's a better movie than Wood Chipper Massacre. Not that that's saying much, but it's a fun little shot-on-video alien movie. You don't see a lot of those. Alien movies, I don't think, are possible to be so effective, because I think the whole thing that's frightening to people about aliens is, you know, if they're from another planet we can't conceive or even begin to imagine, you know, what they look like, you know, what they do to you. And there's the classic myths like, oh, they probe you, little green men. They even joke about that in Invasion of the Saucer Men from '57, but Feeders doesn't really do a lot to make aliens frightening to the audience. They don't really try to. A lot of really, really substandard effects in that movie. It has probably one of the worst decapitated headshots I've ever seen in a movie, where you can tell they like green screened it because there's weird pixelation around the bloody neck, and oh man, it's unbearably bad. But that's a good beer movie. You know, watch that with a friend of yours, make a few cracks in its favor. And you know, even though Feeders, I don't really want to call it bad. There's a lot worse movies on this list than Feeders, but you know, it's the kind of thing you just have to take it for what it is. And even though it's not great, it's a hell of a lot better than the next film, 1997, Bugged. Ronald K. Armstrong directing. This is a little trauma film about exterminators. And I was really looking forward to this movie because there's not enough African-American representation in horror movies. You know, there's good stuff out there like Ganja and Hess, and, you know, Ernest Dickerson directing movies like Demon Knight and Bones. And he also shot Death by Temptation, which I mentioned earlier. Bugged disappointed me because I wanted it to be more of a hangout movie. The trailer kind of made it look like it was going to be a lot funnier and a lot more about its characters just shooting the breeze with each other. And it's way too long. There's not a lot happening in it. And the best part of the movie you've already seen in trauma trailers, if you've ever watched one of their DVDs. They always take that shot of the guy turning into the bug at the end, which is a really bad effect, and still somehow the best part of the movie. And they use that in their promos. And if you've seen that, you might as well not sit through the movie. There's nothing in the movie that's better than that. Bugged is definitely among the worst films on this list. I wasn't let down by the next film on our list, 1997, Matt Jassel, The Necro Files. I can't begin to tell you how much I love this movie. I live in Olympia, Washington, and this film was made there. A lot of it was shot there. It's interesting that The Necro Files is such a politically incorrect, dirty, sleazy, filthy, mean-spirited, gross-out movie that was made in a place like Olympia. The Necro Files is just filthy, and you can tell they were running around downtown Olympia doing crazy things, and they got kicked out of this graveyard where they're pretending to kill baby dolls, and they're waving around dildos, and there's blood and guts everywhere. And I might have a bias toward this movie. Part of the reason I love it is because I had to freeze frame the film while I was watching it. There's a scene where one of the cops is talking to this guy, one of the main characters, about his hallucinations and telling him, you gotta get your shit together, give me some info. He starts beating him up. That scene was filmed in my neighborhood. You can actually see my mailbox at the left of the screen during that scene. So that kind of made me swoon for the movie a little bit. And it's fun seeing all these locations around where I live. But the movie's just really over the top. It's like shot on video stuff. It's super crazy. Doesn't really care if you think it's funny. You know, I really enjoyed it. I had a good time watching that. And it was so much fun to see something of its ilk that was made around where I live. So I really appreciated that. So strong recommendation for The Necro Files. I mentioned that Evil Ed went over the top and loses the audience, but I think The Necro Files goes over the top and consistently entertains throughout. It doesn't get tired seeing all this stuff waved in your face. It's pretty exhilarating. It's a funny watch. We move out of the 1990s now. We're entering the last decade, the 2000s.
Number 61 on this list
is going to be a little film from 2000 called Da Hip Hop Witch. what can you say about the Hip Hop Witch? The Hip Hop Witch. It's not really a movie, and the director's name is hilarious. Dale Restaghini. The movie is comprised, essentially, of footage of rappers and musicians from the late 90s who were quite popular at the time. People like Praz from the Fugees, and Nina Cherry is in there for 2 seconds. I think Vitamin C ends up in there for 2 seconds. Basically, they get all these musicians and rappers to kind of dick around with the cameraman, and part of the film focuses on this fake TV network called the Hip Hop Witch Network. There's so much news about the Hip Hop Witch, the Hip Hop Witch, that it has its own TV network. So keep your eye out for that one. You need to tune into the Hip Hop Witch Network if you really want to know what's going on in the world. And so they're doing all these interviews, and a bunch of these rappers are talking about their encounters with the Hip Hop Witch. And one of them, the most entertaining one by far, is Eminem, our old pal Marshall Mathers, the world's favorite white rapper. Talks about how he went to score free drugs from the Hip Hop Witch, and she attempted to stick her 6-inch finger up his ass and make him drink hot butter. I think that gives you an idea of if this is a film that you're going to want to watch. I can't imagine a lot of people wanting to run out and watch this. I just discovered it for the first time in the last couple of years because my friend Dormarth, who writes an excellent horror zine, was telling me about it, and I just couldn't resist. It sounded so bad. I knew I just had to see it. It's the lowest rated film on this list in terms of IMDb. It's sitting on a 1.7 out of 10 on IMDb. So clearly the users of IMDb have no love for the Hip Hop Witch. But I will say, the Hip Hop Witch is a hell of a lot better than Bugged. I think Bugged has like a 3.6 or a 4 point something. But, you know, the Hip Hop Witch is way funnier than Bugged. The Hip Hop Witch is literally like, hey, we have a chance to grab a few bucks here. Look at all these famous people. Wow. And they loosely string a story of some college kids in the woods around that. And it's supposed to be a Blair Witch parody because it came out about a year after that. Watch The Hip Hop Witch. But, you know, I don't know. If you like the movie, subscribe to the network. That's all I can tell you. The next film is another quote-unquote hood-themed horror film, Leprechaun in the Hood from 2000. The fifth film in the Leprechaun series, following Leprechaun 4 in Space, which is an underrated gem, truly. The Leprechaun movies at this point, if you don't know, I mean, it's pretty much one crowd or the other. You know, even people who love trash movies, even people who love bad horror movies, even a lot of those people will turn their heads to Leprechaun. But I think it's a pretty enjoyable series. And, you know, Leprechaun in the Hood, I mean, really, you can't say it's any worse than any of the other Leprechaun films that precede it. I mean, good God, you know. The worst thing I can say about this movie is that it's kind of painful watching Ice-T run around in a fake afro wig. But I haven't seen Leprechaun Back to the Hood, the sequel, nor have I seen Leprechaun Origins, the 6th and 7th films in the series. And there's an 8th film coming out now, so obviously people are still on the Leprechaun bandwagon. I don't know why those films are so popular with people, but, you know, they hold their own. It's nothing to write home about. You don't need to watch Leprechaun in the Hood. But, you know, it's passable entertainment if you like that kind of thing. And a lot of people do, strangely enough. I'd probably call myself one of them. Next movie on the list is a pretty undervalued little film, I would say. It's called Slashers from 2001, directed by Maurice Devereaux. Slashers is a Canadian film, the last Canadian film on the list here. And I really liked this movie. I believe it was released straight to video, straight to DVD, and it's a lot more deserving than that. The basic premise is that it's a parody of kooky Japanese game shows, but they have 3 maniacal killers chasing a group of contestants around a maze-like series of rooms to see if they can get to the end before time runs out without being killed. And the film takes that premise and moves with it in the simplest way. They just keep moving the action forward. Despite being maybe about like an hour and 40 minutes or a little longer, it doesn't really feel like it wears out its welcome. I liked the way it was written. It was obviously filmed kind of on these sort of rinky-dink sets, but I don't think that harms the movie in any way. There is some funny stuff in there. I think a lot of the actors are not given the best roles, but work pretty decently with what they have. I would recommend it to people who want to see something that's a little bit different than the average horror movie. The premise could go immensely wrong if you don't handle it right, and I feel like Devereaux does a good job with it. They take it to a level that's fits the film perfectly. You know, it's sort of like a satire, but it's not supposed to be like Jonathan Swift or anything. This is kind of lightweight stuff, but, you know, the movie gives all the horror fans what they want. You know, you get some violence in there. There's a little bit of comedy. I think this is a movie more people should see. I was surprised how much I liked it. Slashers is a good film. Next film on the list.
Number 64.
Jeff Lieberman's Satan's Little Helper, 2004. I really liked this movie, but then again, I have not seen a Jeff Lieberman film I didn't like. I mentioned Just Before Dawn earlier. He also made Squirm, Remote Control, Blue Sunshine. Satan's Little Helper is really funny because it takes that child in peril notion that you see in a lot of horror movies and flips it on its head where, oh no, the kid's not in any danger. The kid is succumbing to the strength around him, but it's, you know, he's a part of it very much. Like, it's about this little boy who plays a video game, and the character of Satan from the video game comes to life and starts accompanying him on Halloween night and causing mischief, beats up his sister's boyfriend. And there's a funny little thing in the film where they imply that this poor little kid has like a crush on his older sister, and it's just so weird. But the movie plays a lot with humor in a way that works and doesn't feel like it gets too out of hand. You don't ever get the feeling that they need to pull it back a little bit, like take it down a notch. Like, the movie sustains the right level of craziness throughout and will wring a few laughs out of you. Jeff Lieberman in general, I mean, he has a good sense of how to balance his movies, where he throws everything in there and somehow figures a way to jumble it together, and it makes this weird little stew. And I really wish he'd make another movie. Satan's Little Helper was 14 years ago. It would be great to see what that guy's doing now. But considering that he's worked since the late 70s, you know, he's probably just on time off. So who can blame him? But Jeff, if you ever want to make another movie, please get out there and do it. Because Satan's Little Helper is just as good as his other stuff. Probably among the best, I would say. It's got something for everybody in there. Moving on now to Trick or Treat. 65 on my list from 2007. It's one of the last anthology horror films I'm going to discuss. Trick or Treat, there's not a lot to say about, I think. I remember when it initially came out and it was dumped off on DVD because Warner's didn't want to distribute it theatrically for some reason or another. And I can understand why the film's audience has clamored for a proper release of it, because it is a pretty professional movie, and it does have a really good sense of humor to it. It delivers on all the things you want out of an anthology horror movie, and it kind of segues the stories together in this neat, almost Robert Altman shortcuts kind of way, you know, where they intertwine the characters and the events are happening and you're going back in time and then you go forward again. And Trick or Treat is a really fun little movie. I think my friend Ian said it best when he said that the main character, what's that? Is his name Sam? The little boy with the bag over his head. He was like a Funko Pop before Funko Pop was a thing. And it is a little bit cutesy for its own good, but, you know, it didn't turn me off to the movie or anything. Dylan Baker really steals the movie. The kid he poisons toward the beginning is Thurman Merman from Bad Santa. If you like anthology movies, Trick or Treat, definitely the best modern one. Probably better than a lot of these other films that are coming out that are supposed to be retro, throwback, 80s movies, you know. Trick or Treat actually is a pretty good anthology movie, aside from just being a quote-unquote throwback movie. So definitely check that out if you haven't seen it. I know they just put out a Blu-ray of it.
Number 66.
Getting toward the end here, 2009, My Bloody Valentine. This was the first film I watched at all freaking night, so I saw this one theatrically, and I have to say, I was initially let down. I was hoping they would be playing the 1981 My Bloody Valentine, which is one of the best movies ever. It's hilarious. It's a great movie. But I had never seen the remake. I remember when it came out, I was in high school and it came out in 3D and they made a big thing out of the 3D gimmick when it was promoted in theaters. Like, oh wow, it's like the pickaxe is coming right at you. And you know, the 3D is the worst thing about the movie. It's actually a pretty passable remake. It stays pretty true to the original. My Bloody Valentine does a good job with that. It follows the plot of the original pretty closely, and it throws in a couple other things that weren't in the original that are amusing. Like, there's a scene of this woman at a motel with this sleazy guy, and they have sex, and he films it, and he's gonna dip out, and then the killer comes after them, and Harry Warden's trying to take him down, and it's just totally ridiculous. I admire the fact that it's not only faithful to the original, it does not skimp on the blood and guts. There's tons of kills in this movie, and they bust out horror movie legends like Tom Atkins, so, you know, it's fun to see those guys. And I don't know, considering that trend of going back to older horror films and trying to freshen them up for modern audiences, it's not always a bad thing. I think in the case of the My Bloody Valentine remake, it's silly, but it works. Pretty enjoyable movie. You can't hold a candle to the original, but, you know, it's hard to do that. the 2009 remake on its own terms, I'd say it's pretty fair. Pretty fair little film. It was fun seeing it with a big crowd in the theater.
Number 67.
Terrifier, 2017. Damien Leone. I'll probably catch some slack for this. I'm not riding the hype train on this one. I'm a little bit surprised this movie has gotten the reception it has, and I think it speaks to something that's happening constantly these days, where if somebody releases a horror film that's even remotely decent, that's even remotely watchable, everybody overpraises it right into the ground. And I think that's happened with Terrifier, just like it happened with a lot of other films, some of which are better, some of which are worse. Anytime somebody puts out a decent horror movie these days, it's automatically the best horror film of the decade, of this generation. It's so scary. It's scarier than Psycho. And it's, too much lavish praise for these movies. And that killed it for Terrifier for me. I couldn't invest in the story. I like the bad guy. Art the Clown is great. The actor who plays him is fantastic. The makeup is good. But I don't understand this hype the movie's getting. Like, Bloody Disgusting is saying, it goes to places you've never seen. Where does this movie go that you've never seen? Somebody gets split in half from the genitals up. Well, okay, I've seen that in cannibal movies. I saw that in Bone Tomahawk like 2 or 3 years ago, and that wasn't even a horror film. Oh, there's a scene where a guy rubs shit on the mirror. Isn't that...
Ugh, that's gross, right? You don't see that in movies.
Well, no, that's in a lot of movies. Where did Terrifier go that no other horror film in the last 10 years hasn't? That's what I want to know. And the movie has a strong enough fan base, I would like somebody to get in touch with me and tell me why they think it's a really good movie. I kind of liked the film's reluctance to like its characters. The film very obviously sets up its characters to put them through torture and failure, but I couldn't get invested in the story or the characters. And so just watching them meet their ends isn't really enough to stay rooted into a movie for. I really expected more from it, and I was really let down by Terrifier. It's weird that I don't hear anybody really talking about Starry Eyes from 2014, which is one of the best modern horror films. But everybody is praising the hell out of Terrifier. Starry Eyes is a better movie. The Witch is a better movie. It Follows is a better movie. But every time somebody puts out a horror film these days, it's automatically, it's like, wow, this is the movie of the decade. The scariest film since the last scariest film you ever saw. It's like, well, of course. We come now to the end of my list. 68 films. It's been a long show. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you've had a good time. We're going to conclude now with an anthology horror film that was just released. Directed by Darren Scott, Rusty Cundiff, 2018. It's Tales from the Hood 2.
Oh yeah, baby.
That's right. This is a hard one to get into. Overwhelmingly, the response to this movie has been bad. I know more people that disliked it or just totally disrespected it on the whole than people that actually enjoyed it. But most of the people I know who have seen it tend to agree that the first story of the anthology is the strongest. And I will say that if you are going to watch this movie, make it all the way through the first story. And if you don't like it, you probably don't need to finish it. If you do like it, go through with it, see it to the end. The final story that's not the bookend story is a lot more political than the other stories, but it doesn't really seem like it has a clear message. It seems like there's a leap in logic during that last story. It recalls historical significance and tries to make it relevant, but it feels like they weren't sure of what they wanted to say. I thought the first story was the most effective. It was truly jaw-dropping in that I haven't seen a Hollywood-financed movie in a long time that's had such daring subject matter. It's kind of like Black Devil Doll from Hell on steroids, if you can imagine that. And the second story is about these guys who end up roping in a magician to reach the dead spirit of someone they were trying to steal money from. I really enjoyed that story. It's over the top, it's intentionally comedic, but I thought it fit the tone of the film well. And to tell you the truth, I really like the wraparounds with Keith David. A lot of people will find it too tongue-in-cheek, too campy for their taste. I personally like the callbacks to the first film. I'm a big fan of Keith David, so I'm always glad to see that guy getting work. I was so happy when he showed up on Rick and Morty. He's been doing great work for decades, so I'm always going to love seeing Keith David. And he didn't let me down in this one. He hams it up for sure, but if I'm going to watch anybody ham it up, hey, if it's Keith David, I'm having a blast. And he takes the Clarence Williams role from the first film. I had a great time with it. My minor problems aside with that last story, and my sort of confusion as to its message, I would say that the other stories range from being either slight to good. There's a story in there, I think it's the third or fourth, that feels the slightest of the four. It doesn't really have much to say, but I don't know. It's uneven, like most anthology movies. But I appreciate the fact that it was made. I admired what they were going for. And like I said, the first story was crazy enough to me that I gained respect for the film just during that first 20-30 minutes. So no matter how badly the film derailed or how misguided it may have seemed at points, I still would have liked it just on the strength of that first tale. So I have to say, I think it's a worthy follow-up. None of the stories are as affecting as the Crazy K segment from the first film, but that's its own beast, you know? You can't do apples and oranges here. You're always just going to have something a little bit different. And I took it on its merits. I like Tales from the Hood too, so give it a shot. It's on Netflix. It's pretty easy to find. I haven't seen a lot of movies this year that, to tell you the truth, I really liked. And Tales from the Hood 2 is one of the few that actually stuck out as being memorable to me. So I would recommend it on those merits, for sure. But it's not for everybody. And it's a film that would be really insensitive to a lot of people. So try to make it through that first story, and you'll know right away if you don't want to finish this film or not. Feel free to turn it off. Nobody's going to stop you. But if you stick through it, I don't know, you might take something away from it. I know I enjoyed it. But that's how we conclude our list. It's a pretty diverse but divisive list, I would say. I've had fun flipping around, just trying to get a taste of all these different things. And I always love Halloween because it's a chance to see one of my favorite genres. I love horror films. I'm obsessed with them. I always have been since I was a kid. I used to look at horror novels in the bookstore and just stare at the covers and be taken in and have this fear of being trapped in this little hallway with all these horror books, you know, when it gets dark. Like these books could take on a life and the images on their covers would come and get you. And, you know, there's an appeal to horror movies. So this is my list for 2018. I watched 68 movies. A few little notes. I watched 12 anthology horror films. I watched 15 VHS tapes. 1 Betamax. I finally watched my first Betamax tape, and it was The Visitor, of all things. So that was a cool movie to break in the format with. I look forward to seeing more films on Beta. I saw 2 films in the theater. I watched several films that I would say were quite good, and a few that were quite bad. The first one I watched was The Invisible Man, and I finished up the month with HauntedWeen. I beat my record of last year. I watched 68 films. I believe 5 or 6 of them I'd already seen. Yeah, I'd already seen 6 of them. So I watched 62 new films, which is practically like 2 films a day for the entire month, if you can believe that. And I'm not even burned out on horror movies. It's always Halloween to me. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you for your time. This is the Video Psychosis Podcast. I'm Strong KNOTZ. There's everything I watched for Halloween. Now, what did you watch? Talk to me. Feel free to comment, leave a message here, let me know what you've been watching. Let me know what you thought about the show. If you disagree with me on some of the movies, I'd like to hear what you have to say. We're going to wrap it up here with a little plug. Pretty soon here, the Music by Cam EP will be dropping. 9 songs. Some of the tracks have been used for instrumentals for this show. You may recognize a couple of them, produced by Sweet Leaf Segundo. Keep an eye out for the Music by Cam EP. Pretty soon there will be another episode of the Video Psychosis Podcast. But for now, signing off from the bowels of hell, I'm Strong KNOTZ. See you next time.